In 2007, Terence Watanabe sat inside Caesar's palace and lost more money in a single calendar year than most people will earn across 10 lifetimes. $200 million. Gone, not in a market crash, not in a failed acquisition, not in a fraud, at a blackjack table, at a baccarat shoe, one bet at a time, over 365 days, until there was almost nothing left. This is the story of how that happened, and why almost no one tried to stop it. Watanabe's grandfather started it all with trinkets. Literally, small decorative goods, toys, novelty items, the kind of cheerful plastic clutter that fills gift shops and party stores across America. Oriental Trading Company was founded in Omaha, Nebraska in 1932, and for decades it was a modest, quietly profitable mail-order business. When Terence's father Harry took over, he expanded it. When Terence inherited leadership in the 1970s, after Harry's death, the company was already generating real revenue. But what Terence built on top of that foundation was something of a different scale entirely. He had a gift for volume and velocity. Oriental Trading Company under Watanabe became one of the largest direct mail and wholesale party supply retailers in the United States. Billions of catalog pages mailed, hundreds of millions of units shipped annually, seasonal merchandise, Halloween costumes, Valentine's gifts, graduation decorations, ordered in extraordinary bulk from overseas manufacturers, then sold at prices low enough to make the math work. The margins were thin, but the volume was staggering. By the time he stepped back from the business in the late 1990s and eventually sold it in 2000 to Mid-Ocean Partners for an estimated $500 million, Watanabe had turned his family's novelty company into something approaching a billion-dollar enterprise. He walked away from that sale with wealth somewhere in the nine-figure range. He was in his mid-40s. He had more money than he could reasonably spend, and he had no particular plan for what came next. That absence of a plan matters. It matters more than almost anything else in this story. For years after the sale, Watanabe gave generously. He was known in Omaha's philanthropic circles as someone who followed through, who showed up, who wrote checks that made real differences. He donated millions to hospitals, to civic organizations, to causes that carried his family name quietly and without fanfare. People who knew him described a man who was fundamentally decent, warm, self-deprecating, not consumed by ego. He liked to have fun. He liked people. He liked the energy of a room where something was happening. Las Vegas had that energy, all the time, around the clock, relentlessly, and somewhere in the early 2000s, Watanabe found that the casinos gave him something that post-sale life in Omaha couldn't quite replicate. The stakes, the immediacy, the sensation that what you did in the next 30 seconds had enormous consequence. He started going regularly, then frequently. Then he started spending extended stretches inside Caesar's Palace and the Rio, two properties owned by Harrah's Entertainment, now Caesar's Entertainment, that would become the sites of his financial destruction. He wasn't a casual tourist dropping a few hundred at the slots. He was a whale. In casino parlance, a whale is a gambler who bets at a level so high that a single visit can meaningfully affect the property's quarterly revenue. Watanabe bet at limits that most casinos don't even publicly advertise. He was reportedly wagering as much as $100,000 per hand. The casino industry has an elaborate, carefully engineered infrastructure for people exactly like Terence Watanabe. The suites are enormous and free. The food comes from the finest kitchens, also free. The alcohol flows without any suggestion that perhaps you've had enough, because alcohol and gambling are a combination that casinos have understood for over a century. There are hosts, charming, attentive professionals whose entire job is to make a high-value guest feel seen, comfortable, and above all, motivated to keep playing. Watanabe received all of this and more. By his own later account, and that of his legal team, he was consuming alcohol and prescription pain medication in quantities that raised serious questions about his capacity to make clear-headed decisions. Court documents filed in subsequent litigation describe a man who was, at various points, visibly impaired at the tables. People around him saw it. Casino employees saw it, and the cards kept being dealt. This is where the story becomes something more than just a cautionary tale about a man who gambled too much. It becomes a question about what the people profiting from his losses owed him and what they chose to do instead. In 2007, the year that will define this story forever, Watanabe spent an estimated two-thirds of the year inside Harrah's properties in Las Vegas. He was there so often, for such extended periods, that he essentially became a resident of those casino floors. The number that emerged later, $204 million in losses during that single year, is almost cognitively difficult to process. For context, it represented roughly 2% of Harrah's total gambling revenue that year. One man, 2%. The company reportedly named him their single largest gaming customer. Lost at blackjack, he lost at baccarat. He played for hours on end without sleeping. People who observed him during this period described a man who was not entirely present, who was caught inside something that had long since stopped resembling recreation. He wasn't enjoying himself in any conventional sense. He was somewhere else entirely, inside the compressed, artificial world that casinos construct with such precision, where time dissolves and the outside world ceases to exist. There are accounts, drawn from later court filings, suggesting that casino staff served him drinks even when his condition was obvious, that employees were instructed to keep him playing, that the infrastructure around him was specifically designed not to interrupt the flow of his losses. Whether those accounts reflect deliberate institutional malice or systemic negligence, or simply the cold logic of an industry optimizing for revenue, that question never received a clean answer in court. What is not disputed? By the end of 2007, Terence Watanabe had lost approximately $204 million. He owed Harrah's an additional $14 million in gambling markers, essentially lines of credit that casinos extend to high-volume players and expect to be repaid. He couldn't pay them. When the markers came due and Watanabe couldn't cover them, Harrah's did what creditors do. They referred the matter to prosecutors. In Nevada, failing to pay a gambling debt drawn on a marker is a criminal matter, not a civil one. Watanabe was charged with felony theft and failure to pay gambling debts. The charges carried potential prison time. And here is where the situation inverted in a way that the casino almost certainly did not anticipate. Watanabe hired lawyers, and those lawyers filed a countersuit against Harrah's and Caesars Palace that alleged something deeply uncomfortable, that the casinos had deliberately continued to serve alcohol to a visibly impaired patron, that they had allowed and encouraged him to gamble while his judgment was compromised, and that they bore meaningful responsibility for the scale of those losses. The lawsuit invoked Nevada gaming regulations that prohibit serving alcohol to visibly intoxicated guests, particularly in a gambling context. The countersuit didn't just threaten a legal verdict. It threatened something the casino industry fears far more, a genuinely public accounting of its practices with problem gamblers. Discovery would have meant depositions. Depositions would have meant employees testifying under oath about what they saw and what they were told to do. The details that might have emerged about how casinos manage their wealthiest and most vulnerable customers could have been damaging in ways that extended well beyond this one case. The parties settled in 2010. The terms were not fully disclosed. The criminal charges against Watanabe were dropped. The civil case was resolved quietly. Neither side was required to publicly concede anything. There is a version of this story where Watanabe is purely a victim, a man with an addiction, compromised by substances, preyed upon by an industry that saw his illness as a revenue opportunity. There is another version where a grown man, possessed of extraordinary resources and surrounded by people who cared about him, made a sustained series of catastrophic choices that no one forced him to make. The truth almost certainly contains both versions simultaneously, and the discomfort of holding them together is precisely why this story has endured. His sister, Pam Watanabe Jerds, spoke publicly about the toll the collapse took on the family. She described watching her brother disappear into the casinos, the failed attempts to intervene, the helplessness of caring about someone who was not ready to be helped. That dimension, the human wreckage that radiates outward from one person's destruction, tends to get lost in the raw spectacle of the numbers. $200 million is an abstraction. A family watching someone they love vanish into a compulsive spiral is not. Watanabe had donated millions to Omaha's communities before the collapse. He had built a reputation as someone who understood that wealth carried obligations. What happened in Las Vegas was a rupture with that version of himself, or perhaps a revelation that the version people saw was always in tension with something darker and more consuming beneath it. After the settlement, Watanabe largely withdrew from public view. There were reports of treatment, of efforts to rebuild, of reconnecting with family. He was not entirely without resources. The settlement likely preserved something, but the era of nine-figure wealth was over. The philanthropist with the capacity to reshape a children's hospital wing with a single decision was gone. Whatever remained was quieter and smaller and private. Omaha remembered him. The donations he had made before the collapse didn't disappear. The hospital wings still stood. The civic organizations still benefited from what he had given before the unraveling. That is something. In the taxonomy of spectacular financial collapses, there are people who took their fortunes and extracted maximum personal luxury without giving anything back, and Watanabe was not that person. He gave genuinely before he lost. But the losses also consumed capital that might have continued to fund that generosity. That is the invisible ledger: what didn't get built, what didn't get funded, what communities didn't receive, because $200 million ended up inside Harrah's quarterly earnings report instead. The deeper question this story keeps returning to is one about systems and individuals, about where personal responsibility ends and institutional responsibility begins. Nevada's gaming industry is regulated, licensed, and theoretically constrained by rules designed partly to protect problem gamblers. Those rules exist on paper. How they function in the presence of a man losing $200 million across a single year, that is a different conversation, and one the industry has never been particularly eager to have in public. Las Vegas runs on the logic that the house always wins. It is built on that logic, physically and financially. But that logic only holds comfortably when the person on the other side of the table is making clear, voluntary, informed choices. When the line blurs, when impairment is visible, when compulsion has replaced decision-making, when the person sitting at the table is in some meaningful sense no longer in control, the logic of the house always winning takes on a different moral character entirely. Watanabe's story became a footnote in Nevada gaming history. It showed up in discussions of responsible gambling policy. It was cited in arguments about how casinos should be legally required to handle visibly impaired high rollers. Whether it changed anything structurally is unclear. The industry is large, profitable, and politically influential in the state that most depends on it. Reform moves slowly when the entity being reformed is also a primary funder of the state's economy. What endures is the number, $204 million, in a single year, at blackjack and baccarat tables inside two hotels on the Las Vegas Strip. It is a number that sits at the intersection of addiction and excess and institutional indifference, and it doesn't resolve neatly into a lesson or a verdict. It just sits there, enormous and specific and true. A man turned his family's novelty company into something approaching a billion-dollar enterprise. He built it over decades, carefully and methodically, with a gift for volume and a nose for what people wanted to buy. Then he spent the better part of a year handing it back to a corporation that was very good at taking it. And the people around him, the hosts, the dealers, the employees whose job it was to ensure his comfort, kept pouring the drinks and pushing the chips across the felt. Where personal agency ends and exploitation begins is not always a clean line. Sometimes it isn't a line at all. Sometimes it's a gradient, and the most honest thing you can say is that the gradient existed, and multiple people knew it was there, and almost no one interrupted the process. Terence Watanabe did not end up in prison. He did not end up destitute in any absolute sense. But the fortune that could have compounded, that could have continued to fund hospitals and schools and community organizations for decades, that fortune is gone, redistributed, technically, into the earnings of a publicly traded gaming company. The novelty business, the one his grandfather started in 1932 in Omaha with trinkets and cheerful plastic goods, still exists. Oriental Trading Company was eventually acquired by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway in 2012. The grandfather's company outlasted the grandson's fortune by decades, repurchased by a man who understood, perhaps better than almost anyone, the difference between the value of a thing and the price of losing it. That is the final image of this story. Not the casino floor, not the stacks of chips, not the empty suite at Caesars. It's a novelty company in Omaha, quietly changing hands again, long after the grandson who built it into something extraordinary had given most of what it was worth to a city built specifically to take it. Some fortunes survive their builders. The question is always what the builder does with the time they had.